Hey everyone, and how are you today? So last week on this podcast, we were talking about when parents feel like they're always getting it wrong with with their teens, with their children. And today we want to go a little bit deeper, but on a slight tangent and speak about our relationship with nature versus our relationship with nurturing. So I'm using verses here, but both are interconnected. And this is what we're going to discuss today. So this is my colleague Steve Costello and myself, Patience Modevi, and you are here for another episode of the Wired for Success podcast. So what we're talking about today is this relationship with nature and nurture. So, nature is what is innate in yourself, your character, the things that you do on a daily basis without even thinking about. This is what we call nature. The nurture side is things that you kind of like help to kind of coexist and keep existing in your life. And the reason why we are talking about this is that if you feel as a parent that you are always getting it wrong with your teens, it means that maybe something needs to change. But before you know what needs to change, you need to understand your own relationship with the values you have, the values you hold, where they come from, and also how you are using them. Are they benefiting you in your life? That's when you can then understand what is happening with the relationship with your teens. So today we're talking about that. I'm just going to share a little example. So something that was not in my nature, but I was told to be was to be quiet, to be polite, to fit in a box, because in that way it will show respect to my parents. This came along with different things, as we spoke about in other episodes, obviously tradition, culture, environment, and etc., etc. But in my case, what that brought to me is that unfortunately, I wasn't able to say no as I became an adult. And that created really myself keep staying in this box and not being able to really be myself fully in different environment that I was in. So if that's the case, if I kept doing that and I kept staying in that box, for unfortunately, my children will then also be in a box because I will I will say maybe it's good to be in a box. So therefore, the way you need to be is to be in the box. And I will put everything around the education I'm giving to my children, the environment, the people we are around with, into fitting into that box. We all know that fitting into a box does not work. And this is where the nurturing comes in. I believe that you nurture the things that help you and benefit you, not the thing that doesn't. So if you were to think right now of your own situation, what it is that you have as nature that you keep nurturing that maybe you need to let go of.
Some interesting points in there, Patience. Wow, we could be here for a very long time.
Time.
I think first of all, if you Google AI or whatever you want to do and look up the nature nurture debate, one of the things that you will discover is that there's a lot of good arguments on both sides.
Mm.
That nature is the way and that nurture is the way, and the good reasoned arguments from professionals over the years, and sometimes they're very hard to dispute. So let's not even try and go down there. But one of the things that stood out a moment ago when you were talking, for me at least, is like this little question popped into my head. And the question is some of nature, what we think is nature, actually nurture? And that's because we've got this kind of, let's call it, it's not always a saboteur, but let's call it a saboteur for now. You've got this kind of invisible saboteur that hangs out inside of you. And that invisible saboteur often does things like it might tell us no. We might get this idea that we want to do something, somebody might suggest something, and this little thing in our head says, nope, can't do that. And quite often when we begin to look, it's because of things that have been introduced to us way back in our past, potentially. This is where we'll talk about limiting beliefs. But we've got to ask, where do these limiting beliefs come from? You know, where the kind of these internalized voices, where are they from? Well, they're always from the past. They may come from our parents. They may come from teachers in school. They may come from the culture we live in. You just mentioned those things, Patience. And at the time that these ideas were introduced, they were good for us. They were, in a way, they were protective. They helped us fit in. They helped all sorts of good things, mostly. Okay, some of them wouldn't have been so great, perhaps. But most of the time, they're good things for good reason. But yet they don't always transfer very easily into becoming a parent of a teen, for example, because that's what we're here to talk about. And as you said, Patience, as well, if you presented to your children the version of you in this box, and they pick up the version of you and live that version and make it them, they're limiting themselves already because of your experience. So we need to think about that sort of thing. We need to ask ourselves questions. Is my behavior contributing to limits for my team? It's quite a simple question, but it's quite difficult to answer.
Yeah. Yeah.
So I've got an example from me. When I was 3, 16, people in the family, not just my parents, but aunts, uncles, grandparents, would say, oh, he's really nice boy, but he's shy. That's why he doesn't say much. That's why he doesn't speak out. Well, the reason why I didn't speak out actually was because it was encouraged to be quiet. It was almost a Victorian value, the thing of the child being seen but not heard. You know, so that was overtly, in some ways, encouraged. Stay quiet, stay in your corner. Don't rock the boat. Don't push back at things, and so on and so on. Because of all those attitudes, and I don't blame anybody for it. They had, I think, fairly positive reasons for it. But because of all those things, I found it very difficult to speak out. So in group discussions in school, in high school, it was quiet, me. If a teacher asked me a direct question, no problem, always had an answer. But in a group discussion, I couldn't speak. It was like, oh no, I've got to be quiet, got to keep in my corner, as it were. And that stayed with me for quite a long time. And I really had to work to get out of that. But one of the things I said was, when I eventually become a parent, because I always wanted to be a parent, I'm not going to be like that. I'm not going to say, shut up, my kids. I'm going to say, be noisy, be loud, be proud, say what you've got to say. And they do. And sometimes, you know what, it's really annoying, but they do it anyway. But it's annoying in a very positive way. So we need to, just jumping back to where I began, we need to ask ourselves the question, is some of what we think our nature, is our nature actually our nurture? It's come because somebody introduced us to the idea of whatever it was. So we're a little bit philosophical at the moment, so we need to try and come down into the world of parents and teens.
Yeah. So let's say, so sometimes nature is not necessarily what you've given to your children. It might just be a part of who they are. So let's take the example of Steve. If you have a teenager that is shy, How do you help them nurture that side where they can be outspoken when needed? This is another way that you can use, and this is the reason why nature versus nurturing, it goes together. I feel it goes together in a way, like it's interconnected. You can't do one without the other, or sometimes you might need one to overtake the other. But when we think about making it realistic for parents, it's also that side. So it's also, for example, you have some teenagers who are really good in terms of like academic progress. They have a really good marks and everything. You might think, well, actually, they've got good mark. They can do everything by themselves. I don't need to be behind to support because they do it anyway, That's that's the nature. And actually, they need nurturing. They still need the support. They still need the encouragement, the motivation. This is something that you need to also make sure that you're thinking about. But before, I would say before, and I'm sure Steve will be will agree with me, is that before we even go into that and move to the teenager as a parent, you've got to do the work. You've got to do the work. So when we were talking before, just starting the live, I used this quote. I think, what did I say? I think I said, fake it till you make it. So as you become a parent, there's no manual. We already know that. So what we are doing, we are faking it until we're making it in a way. But now think about it as your own behavior, as your own character, of things that you've picked up and that don't necessarily, you know, benefit you. So you basically stuck in the fake it moment. So you haven't made it, and you may be far from making it, but then you're giving those fake, if we can say, I don't know, fake thoughts or maybe principle down to your children. So this is where we have to break this kind of generational passing of things that don't necessarily serve us. What do you think, Steve?
I think there's some great points in there. One of the interesting things that I teach my clients is just pause for a minute.
Mm,
So, for example, you're with your teens and you feel that one of your values is going to come in because we do notice
yeah.
what we're going to say. So you feel this value is going to pop in. So just pause for a minute. Hang on a minute. Is this relevant? Is this value actually appropriate? Does this value work for them? It maybe did work for me, or maybe I was pushed for it to work for me. But is it going to work for them? So just pause. Now it's taken me longer to say those few things than it does to think it. So it's always good to stop, pause, and have a little think. We talk a lot in these podcasts about reacting and responding, and we always want to aim to respond rather than react. It's very much the same with this as well. So we need to think about that. Is this belief serving me still? Will it
Mm,
serve them? Ask that question. It's
mm,
also good. One of the things we do want to be doing with our teams is creating dialogue. What do you think about this? This is the way I was brought up. This is the way I was taught, blah, 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 blah. What do you think? Don't let them get away with saying, but it's not like that today, as my kids sometimes do. That's not an answer. What do you think in there? It's all about you. It's not about what your generation happens to think or not think about a particular issue. So asking questions is a great way to challenge these things.
yeah.
When your teen comes up with something, I want to do this, whatever it might be, and that no pops into your head. Why? Why does that no come into my head? Where does that come from? What does it mean? Okay, some things are obvious. If it's about safety and potential danger, and we may need to say no, but it may not be there. So why does that no come into my head? What is that all about? It doesn't mean you're wrong. I think that's an important
Yes,
thing to say.
that's important. Yeah.
It does not mean you're wrong. But it's a great way to look, because once these values that you hold were there for a reason, maybe to protect you, to maintain harmony in the family, a ton of stuff. So as I said earlier, separating nature from nurture is pretty challenging. It's pretty difficult. But I've got a good example that has an amazing gray area. So I know another coach, and this particular coach described herself as 100% introvert until she gets on a stage. And when she gets on a stage, she is absolutely not introverted. However, when she comes off the stage, she feels exhausted and she's got to retreat away from the crowd into a corner, usually on her own, which is quite interesting. So is that nature or nurture? Hard to answer.
Really hard.
But as
Really.
individuals, we often have some clues for the answers to those things. I can't answer that question for her. I've discussed it with her and still didn't come away with a clear answer. She said at the end of it, she said, I'm an introvert, period. That is me. Which is, no, that's her place. She's happy with that, but she doesn't push that on her children
Mm,
because that isn't who they are.
yeah.
And that is the key. Is it who they are? Think about that. So where are we going to go now with this
And
patience?
this
Because we
this
could be here
really
for a
joins
very
this,
long time.
yeah, this really joins the nature argument where to say like, okay, this is my nature, but this is not their nature. It's also understanding that, which is really important. Um, and I think one thing I guess when you said there's nothing wrong as well with being in a certain space at a certain point, that's really important because we are different versions of ourselves as we go along.
Yeah,
And certainly the version that you were when you were a teenager yourself, and you were seeing all those nature things that maybe your parents were maybe telling you to hold, those values and principles they were telling you to hold, and you were like, oh, I don't think so. It's not like exactly what Steve Children was saying. Like, it's not like that now. Surely in your teenage years, you were saying that to your parent or thinking it. And then far along the way, now you're the parent now, and you're thinking, oh, actually that made sense here, or I can understand why this was happening. So it's still, I think it's a good exercise to
yeah,
really see what what serves you, what serves your purpose in your life, and how you can support the teenagers to be even more of their full self, and understanding that.
yeah. We do need to know too, as I've already said, really, we also need to know what doesn't serve.
Yeah.
But when we're looking at what doesn't serve, this is really important that we shouldn't be judging.
Mhm.
We shouldn't be blaming mum, dad,
No.
granddad, whatever. That's not helpful. But we should be curious.
Yeah.
Where did that come from? Wow, wow. Yeah, okay, that worked for them. Why? I wonder why it worked for them.
Mhm.
Ask them questions if you still can. Often in my family, people have passed away now, so I can't ask the questions anymore. But if you can, ask the question, why did that serve? What was, what made it so important? And seek to understand, as we should be encouraging our own team to
It's
seek to
to also
understand.
ask question. Yeah.
Yeah. So that is a great bit of nurture.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And this is full circle.
Yeah.
Obviously, you understand, like we could go on and on with this subject. The reason why this subject is important is for you to get to this level where instead of saying, like we were talking about last week, I'm always getting it wrong with my teen, is saying, okay, I am at a space where communication is open with my teens and we can learn from each other.
Yeah, absolutely. And that is a great place to be. Remember, everybody, if you've got a comment or if you've got a question, don't hesitate. Get in touch. We'll always respond. And you never know, you might actually pick up something new and useful and you think, oh, yeah, that's cool. All it takes is a question or a comment. Okay.
All right, then. So we'll see you next week for another episode of the Wired for Success podcast. Thank
Take,
you.
take care, everybody. Bye.
Bye.